My name's Daniel Gallant. I'm 38 years old. I currently live in Prince George, British Columbia, Canada. I'm studying Masters in Social Work, focusing on disengagement from right-wing extremism. I spent about almost I spent almost a decade in the white supremacist movement in Canada, and I'm now engaged in a lot of counter-extremist and anti-racism work. There wasn't any formal incentives. The biggest payoff was a justifiable expression of my anger and rage. Another benefit that I received was my ego was fed because I believe people respected me or feared me or that sort of thing. But there was no benefits like that when I started working in a bar. I was hired for being a liaison between the group that I worked for. They were Hell's Angels within that specific bar, drug dealing. I was hired as a liaison with a group of skinheads who were doing a lot of damage in their bars. So one of the benefits I received from that position was I got to feel like I was in a position of power. And women were attracted to someone who had power. And if you exerted the physical power on the streets, there was certain types of women that I was attracted to at the time that were attracted to that power. So the things that we do were hang out. We go out for dinner and stuff, and there were times where there'd be a bunch of us with our kids going out for dinner, and then like my daughters would wave a flag while we're walking down the road, little flags, and things like that. And we'd do campaign runs of leaflets and stickers and different things at universities, government buildings, parks, things like that. We'd go to bars and talk to people and educate them about the truths of the movement and how we weren't just a bunch of bullies, and that there was actually doctrine and logic to it, and win people over as often as possible. And then there'd be other times where we just go out, drink, and fight. And sometimes we'd have the intentions of going out to drink and find anti-racists and then beat the out of them and take their belongings. And do things like that as well. Looking at people who were charismatic leaders, such as the organization that I belong to, World Church of the Creator, at that time, the Pontifex Maximus Supreme Leader was Matt Hale in the United States, who was a lawyer. He was smart. He was willing to speak to violence, and the doctrine of that organization was extensive compared to other groups. Ben Clausen, who is from Canada, wrote the books and founded the organization and was charismatic too, but had long passed he had died when I had joined, before I had joined. There's people like that, but the people that I would call leaders with charisma were guys on the street who were doing the violence. When I was recruited, the guy who recruited me had told me to stay away from propagandists, that they were a bunch of manipulators and weren't willing to carry out the war. So what some would call charismatic is not necessarily what I would call charismatic at that time. There was two main ways that the movement impacted my relationship with people. One was when I left home when I was 12, I ended up being taken in and adopted by First Nations people. different families in a couple communities. And after I entered the movement, of course, I detached and separated from them and ended up hurting many of them in a variety of different ways, which includes extreme violence. So the other way that my relationships were affected was at that time were a positive way. I wasn't attached to my family and so forth, but when I got very well versed in the right-wing literature, I started building bridges between me and my family that I was isolated from, immediate family and extended family, because they were very right-wing Christian. And so they believed that the Jews were running things and so on. So it was easy for me to make connections with them now, because now we had a shared ideological piece. They didn't necessarily like my violence, but that's the only thing that differentiated me from the common people in the area communities I lived in, was that I believed the same things as them, but I acted in violence, extreme violence, and that's the only thing that differentiated us. So I was able to build bridges and relationships with people more effectively than I had ever been able to in the past, because I had the same ideology as the communities I lived in after I joined the movement. My kohkum, which is Cree for grandma, she'd seen me in the store one day after I had returned back up north after solidifying my time in the movement. And this was after one of the guys I took hostage and beat really badly. And she came up to me and she just looked at me in the eyes, and she had tears in her eyes. And she had said something to the effect that you are beating people with sticks and different things, but I want you to know you're still my grandson no matter what. And even though I didn't have biological ties to her, that was really hard to swallow. But I walked away, shut it down. I was in the store buying handgun bullets for a stolen pistol. So yeah, that situations did happen. My kohkum, there was a moment about 3.5 years ago. I was up north hunting, and one of her daughters, who I call my auntie, said that I had to come to the Indian Reserve. So I followed her in her vehicle. I got there, and they were calling kohkum to come. And she came, and I went to get out of the vehicle, and there were some guys that I had fought in the past. One guy who had stabbed me. And I got scared, and I reached for my gun, and I went to pull it out. And then I realized that what am I doing? I 10 years out in this sort of reaction. But I know from past experience with those particular people that the respect for the women is so ingrained within the culture that there's nothing that's going to happen. So I got out and I had lunch with everybody, and kohkum came and grabbed my hands and just looked at me. And the way she looked at me, I've never felt so loved in my life. And I got what all the disengagement process, the exit, and the healing that has occurred in my life. I understood there what that meant.